I've always hated winter. Not just the cold, not just the endless shoveling of snow, but the way the world seems to go quiet. Too quiet. I thought I'd gotten used to it, but nothing could prepare me for the blizzard that hit Shadow Creek. The small cabin I had rented for the weekend wasn't much to look at. One bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a fireplace that hadn't seen proper use in years. It was perfect for the kind of solitude I needed. Life in the city had become too much. The noise, the people, the endless chatter, I just needed a break. Shadow Creek seemed ideal. Isolated, peaceful, and blanketed in snow. The weather forecast had mentioned snow, but nothing extreme. Just enough to coat the ground and make everything look like a postcard. I wasn't worried. I had packed enough food for 3 days, my phone was fully charged, and I had a stack of books to keep me company. Besides, if anything went wrong, there was a small general store about a mile down the road. No big deal. Or so I thought. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire, ate some canned soup, and curled up on the couch with one of my books. The silence of the woods around me was unsettling at first, but after a while, I found it soothing. By the time I went to bed, snow had started to fall, light and fluffy, just as the forecast predicted. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound that didn't belong. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to jolt me awake. At first, I thought it was the wind. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind pressed against it, but this sound was different. It was deliberate. A knock. Not loud, but sharp. 3 quick raps against the door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Who could it be? The cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor, and no one knew I was here. I told myself it was probably a tree branch tapping against the wood, but deep down, I knew better. Tree branches don't knock. For a long time, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to move. The knocking didn't come again, and eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was just a dream. I pulled the blanket over my head and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, the world outside was buried under 2 feet of snow. The sky was gray, heavy with more to come, and the wind had picked up, howling through the trees like a living thing. I tried to shake off the unease from the night before. It was just my imagination, I told myself. Nothing more. But when I opened the door to step outside, my stomach dropped. There, in the fresh snow, were footprints. Bare footprints. They led from the edge of the woods to my front door, then back again. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling. My first thought was to call someone, anyone, but when I grabbed my phone, there was no signal. Of course. Shadow Creek was notorious for its spotty reception. I cursed under my breath and paced the tiny cabin, trying to think. Who would be out here, barefoot in the snow? A lost hiker? A prankster? None of it made sense. The tracks were too clear, too deliberate. Whoever it was had come straight to my door. I decided to stay inside. The snow was still falling, and the wind was growing stronger by the hour. The general store could wait. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and spent the rest of the day huddled by the fire, trying to read but unable to focus. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made my skin crawl. That night, the knocking came again. Louder this time. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart racing. The sound was unmistakable. 3 sharp knocks, just like before. I stared at the door, my breath caught in my throat. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted me to know they were there. For a long moment I didn't move. Then, gathering every ounce of courage I had, I crept to the window and peeked through the curtain. The snow was coming down in thick sheets, but in the faint light of the porch, I could just make out a figure standing there. It was tall, thin, and completely still. Its face was hidden by the shadow of its hood, but I could feel its eyes on me. Watching. Waiting. I stumbled back from the window, my chest tight with panic. This couldn't be happening. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there. The knocking came again, harder this time. I grabbed a poker from the fireplace and shouted, "Go away! I'm calling the police!" No response. Just silence. And then a voice. Low and rasping, barely more than a whisper. "Let me in." I dropped the poker, my hands shaking so badly I could barely breathe. The voice was like nothing I'd ever heard. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. What should I do? Run? Hide? Stay quiet? Before I could decide, the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, and the only light came from the dying embers in the fireplace. I could hear the wind howling outside, but nothing else. No footsteps. No knocking. Just silence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire with the poker in my hands, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally came, I dared to look outside. The figure was gone, but the footprints remained, circling the cabin now, taunting me. By the third day, the storm had become a full-blown blizzard. The snow was piled high against the windows, and the wind was so loud it drowned out everything else. I was trapped, completely cut off from the outside world. I tried to keep myself busy, but it was no use. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure. I heard its voice. "Let me in." That evening, as the storm raged on, I heard something new. Not knocking this time, but scratching. Long, slow scratches along the walls of the cabin. It moved from one side to the other, circling me like a predator stalking its prey. I shouted for it to stop, but the scratching only grew louder. I tried to block it out, but it was everywhere. Inside my head. Inside my bones. I felt like I was losing my mind. And then, the voice came again. "You can't hide." I screamed, covering my ears, but it didn't help. The voice was inside the cabin now, whispering from every corner. I could feel its presence, cold and oppressive, filling the room like smoke. That night was the worst. The storm reached its peak, and the cabin shook with every gust of wind. The fire had gone out, and I was too afraid to relight it. I huddled under a blanket, clutching the poker like a lifeline. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of the door creaking open. My heart stopped. I hadn't unlocked it. I hadn't even gone near it. In the dim light of the snow filtering through the windows, I saw the figure standing in the doorway. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, its shadow stretching across the floor. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The figure stepped inside, one slow, deliberate step at a time. Its feet were bare, leaving wet prints on the floor. As it moved closer, I could see its face, or rather, the absence of one. Its skin was pale and smooth, featureless except for two sunken, black holes where its eyes should have been. It reached out a hand, long and skeletal, and I finally found my voice. I screamed and swung the poker with all my strength. It passed through the figure as if it weren't there, and I stumbled back, falling to the floor. The figure leaned down, its empty eyes staring into mine. "You should have let me in," it whispered. When I woke up, the storm had passed. The cabin was quiet, the door shut tight. There was no sign of the figure, no footprints, no scratches on the walls. It was as if nothing had happened. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I packed my things and left Shadow Creek that morning, trudging through the snow to the general store, where I called for help. The locals didn't believe me, of course. They said I must have been dreaming, that the isolation had gotten to me. But I know the truth. Something was out there, in the storm. Something that wanted to get in. And I have a feeling it's still waiting. Winter always had a way of wrapping its cold fingers around my life. Growing up in Minnesota, I was no stranger to heavy snow and frozen lakes. But that winter, the one where everything changed, felt colder than any other I'd lived through. I had just broken up with Amy. 5 years together, gone in a single argument. Needing space, I decided to retreat to the old family cabin near Lake Grimwater. It had been years since I'd been there. The cabin was small, rustic, and perched on the edge of the lake. No cell service, no internet, just me and the wilderness. It sounded like exactly what I needed to clear my head. The drive out was uneventful, though the snow was already piling up. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the frozen lake. It was a beautiful, eerie sight. The ice stretched endlessly, shimmering under the fading light. But there was something about it that made me uneasy. I brushed it off as leftover tension from the breakup. The first night was quiet. I lit a fire, made some instant noodles, and tried to lose myself in an old book I found on the shelf. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows, but I felt safe inside. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. But then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was just the wind knocking a branch against the cabin. But the sound was too deliberate, too steady. I grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window, but all I could see was the thick darkness pressing against the glass. Nothing moved. The snow outside was untouched. Shaking my head, I told myself it was nothing and went to bed. The next morning, I decided to check the lake. I wasn't much of a fisherman, but I thought I might drill a hole in the ice, just to see if anything was alive under there. The air was bitterly cold as I stepped outside, my boots crunching in the snow. The lake stretched out before me, silent and still. Too still. As I approached the edge, I noticed something odd. About 20 feet out on the ice, there was a hole. Perfectly round, as if someone had drilled it recently. But there were no footprints leading to or from it. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, one that had nothing to do with the cold. Who had been out here? Why didn't they leave any tracks? I stared at the hole for a long time, half expecting something to emerge from it, but nothing happened. Eventually, I turned back to the cabin, trying to shake the unease that was creeping into my chest. That night, the tapping came again. Louder this time. I froze, listening as it echoed through the cabin. It wasn't coming from the walls or the roof. It was coming from underneath. The cabin was raised slightly off the ground, but it wasn't high enough for someone, or something, to crawl beneath it. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation, but nothing made sense. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, determined to prove to myself that it was just an animal, or maybe ice shifting beneath the snow. The night was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness as I circled the cabin, but I found nothing. No tracks, no signs of movement, nothing to explain the sound. And then I heard it again. Tap. 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 But this time, it wasn't coming from the cabin. It was coming from the lake. I turned toward the sound, my breath catching in my throat. There, at the edge of the ice, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly arms that hung at odd angles. Its face was pale, almost glowing in the moonlight, and its eyes were like deep, black pits, staring straight at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me, and then it pointed. Slowly, deliberately, it raised one long finger and pointed toward the center of the lake. When I finally regained control of my legs, I ran back into the cabin, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. What had I just seen? Who or what was that? I spent the rest of the night huddled by the fire, clutching a knife I'd grabbed from the kitchen. Every sound, every creak of the cabin, made me jump. I didn't sleep. I didn't dare. By morning, the figure was gone, but the hole in the ice was still there. It looked larger now, as if it had grown overnight. I told myself to pack up and leave, to get as far away from Lake Grimwater as possible. But something stopped me. Curiosity. A part of me needed to know what was in that hole. I couldn't leave without finding out. I waited until midday, when the sun was at its highest, and made my way back to the lake. The snow was blindingly white under the sunlight, but the cold still bit at my skin. The hole in the ice loomed ahead of me, dark and foreboding. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The ice around the hole wasn't just wet, it was stained red. My stomach turned as I realized what it was. Blood. Fresh blood. I should have run. I should have turned around and never looked back. But I couldn't. I had to know. Kneeling at the edge of the hole, I peered into the darkness. The water was black, impossibly deep, and as still as glass. For a moment, I saw nothing. And then, something moved. A hand? It shot up from the water, skeletal and dripping, and grabbed my wrist. Its grip was like ice, burning and numbing at the same time. I screamed and pulled back, but it was too strong. The thing in the water was pulling me in. Just as I thought I was going to be dragged under, I heard a voice. Low and guttural, it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Join us. With a final burst of strength, I wrenched my arm free and stumbled back, falling onto the ice. The hand disappeared beneath the water, and the hole seemed to close up, as if it had never been there. I didn't stop running until I was back at the cabin. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and whatever else I could carry, and I left. I didn't care about the snowstorm rolling in or the fact that the roads might be dangerous. I had to get away. I never told anyone what happened at Lake Grimwater. Who would believe me? But sometimes, in the dead of winter, when the world is quiet and the nights are long, I hear the tapping again. And I know it's still out there, waiting for me.